Howdy, yo, welcome back. Washington, D.C. is, at its core, a city that is shrouded in mystery. But aren't all major cities when we truly peel back the narrative? If you asked anyone what the strangest aspect of Washington, D.C. is, many may look at you dumbfounded, as the history of Washington, D.C. and the acceptance of the current narrative has been all but ingrained into our brains from grade school. However, today, we will dive into some of the most outlandish theories regarding Washington, D.C. as we look through a collection of the oldest photographs of the capital city interspersed with images I took on my trip there a few weeks ago. I wanted a platform to share all the photographs I have accumulated of the city without the necessity for a deep dive into the accepted modern history. Right off the bat, one of the strangest theories I've encountered is that of the Washington, D.C. neighborhood of Friendship Heights, being a location where it's theorized that time is being held in the highest esteem. Some would say time is being worshipped. According to numerous deep dives and discussions in forums online, I found a cornucopia of people claiming they feel time moves differently in this area of Washington, D.C. Some have mentioned the concept of a liminal space. Still, others are quick to point out the outstanding number of time-related symbolism that is showcased throughout this neighborhood. If you keep your eyes open, we're told, you'll start to notice sundials, hourglasses, fancy and ancient clocks, and other timepieces pretty much everywhere in public art, on buildings, and even inlaid in the sidewalk throughout Friendship Heights. Diving into Friendship Heights a bit further, there's actually a lot more meat on the bone of this theory. Friendship Heights is in northwest Washington, D.C., and does not have clearly defined borders, so it is said to also reach into Maryland as well. Within the Maryland portion of the Friendship Heights neighborhood is the village of Friendship Heights, a special taxation district. Although not a technical municipality, seemingly for plausible deniability, the village was established the whole way back in 1914. A special taxation district is, by definition, independent, special purpose, governmental units that exist separately and outside of local governments. These districts have substantial administrative and fiscal independence and are founded to perform a single function or a set of related functions, with the first special tax districts in America being run by the park companies in the 18th century and the canal companies in the 19th century. Now, the village of Friendship Heights in D.C. is only 34 acres. However, it is primarily high-rise buildings, and the village of Friendship Heights has the highest population density of any census-designated place in the entire United States, higher even than Manhattan. Again, since Friendship Heights is not a defined neighborhood with limits, the exact borders are up for debate, but many today agree that Friendship Heights exists almost entirely in Chevy Chase, D.C. Chevy Chase is named for Chevy Chase, Maryland, which the D.C. Chevy Chase is adjacent to. Chevy Chase was the original name of this land given to Charles Calvé, the Baron Baltimore, in 1725, with that name being itself derived from 1388 and the French word chevauché, which was the name of a border raid or horse charge that was most usually associated with Lord Percy of England and Earl Douglas of Scotland, who fought a battle on the Cheviot Hills on the border of England and Scotland, which was commemorated in the infamous Ballad of Chevy Chase. Okay, so back to Friendship Heights. Within this neighborhood, which has countless illustrations of time, is housed the Geico headquarters, originally known as the Government Employees Insurance Company, hence the name, as well as the headquarters of the Ritz-Carlton hotel chain. But it gets deeper. This section of Northwest Washington, D.C. was specifically developed as a streetcar suburb. A streetcar suburb was a neighborhood or section of a city sometimes entire towns, that were shaped around electric trolley systems as the primary means of transportation. They began to pop up in America in the late 1800s, and the streetcar company in Washington became known as the Chevy Chase Land Company, who derived their name from the Maryland area which the streetcar suburb bordered. This original line in Washington became known as the Chevy Chase Line, serving a large portion of Washington, D.C., and this portion of D.C., the Friendship Heights area, arose around the electric trolley system, beginning from the year 1890 onward. Now, a theory that dives into the more mysterious reaches of Washington, D.C. is one regarding the founding and the purpose of the Smithsonian institution. Many theorists, including myself, have long dove into the history of alleged giants in America. For the better part of 150 years, from roughly the late 1700s through the early 1900s, we have countless published reports, many scientific in origin, which describe gigantic human bones being discovered in burial mounds throughout America. These reports suggested that some sort of unified culture existed in America, as the burial mounds became associated with a single group, albeit with many offshoots, known as the Mound Builders. Now, these reports claimed of finding skeletons anywhere from 6.5 to up to 12 feet tall within these mounds that existed, that were constructed with precision, and many were said to have used earthen bricks and other forms of seemingly advanced architecture and masonry. Where does the Smithsonian come into all of this? Essentially, as the cleanup crew. However, before we engage that portion of the theory, let's take a step back. Around the year 1608, explorer John Smith made his way into the Chesapeake Bay, being the first explorer to fully adventure up the body of water. Quickly, Smith was said to have received an encounter by over 50 indigenous people of a rather striking appearance. These indigenous people of the Chesapeake, according to Smith, were rather pale, with different shades of auburn, red, and brown hair, and many had what he described as European eyes, often believed to mean light-colored eyes. However, the most striking feature, according to Smith, was the size and stature of these indigenous people, who he described as anywhere from roughly 6 feet to 8 feet tall. These indigenous people were known as the Susquehannock, and the massive Susquehanna River, which runs from New York to the Chesapeake Bay, now bears their name. According to Smith, the Susquehannock had very advanced fortresses and possession of brass weaponry and ornaments, and had established many ingenious paths or roads with bordered, man-made rock formations. Why is this relevant? Well, the Susquehannock, around the end of the 17th century, after decades of conflict with nearby settlers and other indigenous groups, in what is a very convoluted history, were then tempted to the area that became Washington, D.C., to settle the land around the Potomac River. The Susquehannock had previously been employed in the settling of other regions of Maryland and Pennsylvania for the European settlers. However, after just a few years in Washington, D.C., we are told the settlers in the area accused the Susquehannock of raiding, and both Maryland and Virginia then declared war on the Susquehannock people. The Susquehannock essentially developed Washington, D.C., roughly a century before it became the nation's capital, only to be wiped out in Pennsylvania in 1763. What's moreover, in PA, the Susquehannock had a massive final fortress known as the Conestoga Town, in which were founded the inventions of the covered wagon, or the Conestoga wagon, and the Conestoga repeating rifle, two inventions which made conquering the West possible. Finally, the Susquehannock were theorized by numerous scientific and historic communities in the 18th and early 19th centuries to be descendants of the Mound Builders. seemingly giving a reasoning for the Susquehannocks' substantial size and also for the symbolism of the Susquehannock that appears on early American art, and how many of the aspects of the Susquehannock have been purposefully convoluted with the histories of other indigenous people. The Smithsonian was formulated as an idea in roughly 1816 in Washington, D.C. by leading scholars and philosophers who believed they needed to promote their understanding of history and useful knowledge. Little did they know, by 2025, we'd be able to see through the charade. The Smithsonian was founded essentially on becoming the authority on science and history in America in the early 19th century. And following the founding of the Smithsonian, we begin to see many institutions, universities, and places of learning take the reins to controlling the narrative. Members of the Smithsonian included the highest-ranking members of government: John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, James Madison, James Monroe, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and the Marquis de Lafayette, just to name a few. The original institution of men met in the Capitol building from 1824 onwards, before their charter expired in the year 1840, and a permanent Smithsonian was founded in 1846. Founded inside a new structure known as the Smithsonian Castle. However, what the Smithsonian originally gained infamy for was excavating burial mounds and confiscating the remains, as detailed in just about half of all articles related to the finding of giant bones. The proof is seemingly in the pudding, but to add fuel to this argument, we have the ultimate plausible deniability, which occurred in the year 1934. The curator of anthropology at the Smithsonian Institution in the year 1934 came forth after roughly 120 years of collecting specimens and definitively claimed that giants never existed in America. He claimed the humans let their imaginations run wild when they saw reports of giants, and these reports of giant bones are vastly exaggerated and simply not true. Yet again, what's remarkable here is that the Smithsonian is listed at being at these excavations of the burial mounds and taking the remains. We have this listed in numerous published articles in places like the New York Times from the 1800s through the early 1900s. We have countless reputable publications making note of not only the proof of gigantic bones, but also of the Smithsonian's presence at these locations. Furthermore, we have in modern times, really since 1934 and the Smithsonian's ruling that giants did not exist, we have since then the belief that 18th century and 19th century giant discoveries were hoaxes. But what if the outlandish claims of 15-foot tall and 20-foot tall giants were plausible deniability that were being enacted by organizations, possibly those like the Smithsonian, to make the true history of 7 and 8-foot tall giants seem unbelievable? Again, most reports state that the giants that were found in the burial mounds were 6 to 8 feet tall. Not exactly giant by biblical standards, but significantly larger than average height today. Yet near the end of the 19th century, we also begin to see reports of 10, 12, and 14-foot tall giants being compared to the Nephilim. These were later proven to be the bones of larger animals, like blue whales. Again, all of this becomes rather fascinating, as for a common man in the 19th century to fabricate a hoax using giant bones, using bones of a blue whale, many questions arise. Where would a blue whale be found in the Midwest? And how could any of these hoaxes of giant human bones having existed in these communities gone on without anybody noticing? How could someone fabricate an entire ancient burial mound and then include the bones of a rare species of marine animal in the middle of the Midwestern United States? Again, the idea that the Smithsonian claims that all of these giants found in burial mounds were hoaxes, yet many of these hoaxes seem much more complicated given the current narrative today than if we believe the history that rather tall men actually existed. Furthermore, the only way I truly see the hoax of bones of blue whales being found in the Midwest coming to fruition in the late 19th century would be through a group who had access to giant animal bones. And who had access to that sort of thing during this time period? Museums. And who was the largest museum in America? The Smithsonian Institution. Just a little food for thought. This is the same Smithsonian in 1934 who completely shut down all belief of giants in the scientific community. The same Smithsonian that was founded on land that was first settled and developed by the Susquehannock indigenous people, described for centuries by multiple European settlers as well over 6 feet tall. The last theory or aspect of Washington, D.C., which absolutely feels like an anomalous piece of the narrative, which many have never heard of before, from July 12th through July 29th of 1952, numerous UFOs were reported to have been sighted over Washington, D.C., culminating in 2 consecutive weekends of sightings being witnessed by thousands of people. According to UFO historians, during this time period, Project Blue Book and the Air Force received the most reports of UFOs it had ever received before or since this time, and the Washington, D.C. sightings became considered one of the most well-known UFO sightings of all time. For example, in 1952, during this time known as the UFO flap, the Air Force received over 717 new UFO reports. Director of Project Blue Book, Edward J. Rupert, was later quoted as saying, and I quote, "During the 6-month period in 1952, 148 of the nation's leading newspapers carried a total of over 16,000 articles about flying saucers," end quote. Many believe this began in April, when Life magazine published an article claiming the Air Force had taken a vested interest in discovering and capturing UFOs. This was the Life magazine cover to feature Marilyn Monroe and was one of the most read of all time. By June of that year, 1952, UFOs exploded onto the mainstream as the most discussed story of that month would be the June 1st official report filed by the Howard Hughes Aircraft Company claiming they had encountered a UFO in Los Angeles. Exactly 1 month later, on July 1st, 1952, 2 F-94 interceptors were reported as attempting to overtake a UFO outside airspace above Boston. This UFO craze was further escalated when on July 14th, 2 commercial pilots came in contact with 8 UFOs in what became known as the Nash-Fortenberry sighting. During this time, William Nash and William Fortenberry were said to have witnessed, for several minutes, 8 UFOs flying in an echelon military formation over the Chesapeake Bay. Because this sighting occurred over the course of several minutes, and the UFOs appeared to not be in fear of the commercial craft, many UFO historians believe these pilots were able to give an accurate description and measurement of the object's motion and size comparable to the known landmarks. The Nash-Fortenberry sighting was officially listed on the Project Blue Book files as, quote, unknown, unsolved. Then, these UFOs appeared to move from the Chesapeake Bay, the former home of the Susquehannock people, to Washington, D.C., just like the Susquehannock people did. Around 11:40 p.m. on Saturday, July 19th, 1952, Air Traffic Controller Edward Nugent reported seeing an alignment of 7 UFOs entering Washington airspace. What preceded plays out like a movie. Nugent contacted his superior, Harry Barnes, who also witnessed the UFOs in formation, and he is quoted as saying, and I quote, we knew immediately that a very strange situation existed. Their movements were completely radical compared to those of ordinary aircraft." End quote. Barnes then had multiple controllers check the radar to make sure it was functioning properly, and after it was proven to be 100% operational, the controllers also joined in the astonished crew, watching the UFOs on the radar. Quickly, the formation seemed to disperse in different directions, as multiple blips were said to have then appeared throughout Washington, D.C., appearing at rapid speed, said to be impossible for any aircraft at that time. The UFOs then formed over the White House before moving to the Capitol building and then to Andrews Air Force Base. Immediately, we're told, Andrews was alerted. However, their radar did not appear to show any of the anomalies. However, Airman William Brady, who was working the radar tower at Andrews, reported he, and I quote, saw an object which appeared to be like an orange ball of fire, trailing a tail, and it was unlike anything I had ever seen before, end quote. Brady then reported that the UFO took off at incredible speed away from his location. At this time, the UFO or UFOs were said to have headed back to the National Airport, where pilot S.C. Pierman was waiting in the cockpit of his craft for permission to take off. Pierman then witnessed, over the course of 14 minutes, the series of UFOs dancing in the sky above the airport. Both the National Airport and Andrews Base tracked several of the objects, or attempted to, before they all disappeared, taking off at unheard of speeds in every direction. The disappearance of the UFOs seemed to coincide with the arrival of two Air Force F-94 Starfires sent to intercept the craft. However, as the F-94s patrolled the area, they began to run low on fuel near 5 a.m., at which point the UFOs returned until the sun rose. By the following Sunday, the UFO sightings in Washington were national front page news. Again, take the entirety of this narrative with a grain of salt as always, but isn't it remarkable that the supervisor and leader of Project Blue Book, Edward Rupert, just so happened to be in the White House the night that these UFO sightings occurred? The following Saturday, July 26, 1952, a pilot and crew at the National Airport witnessed suspicious lights beginning around 8:15 p.m. Within moments, both the airport and the Andrews base were tracking this craft. At the same time, Albert M. Chop, the spokesperson for Project Blue Book, arrived at the National Airport to deny reporters access to the radar screens. He was then said to have joined the party that was monitoring the UFOs. According to these official reports, the craft could hover completely still, they could travel slowly, they could reverse or change directions at ease, and at times they would travel across the sky at speeds estimated to be 7,000 miles per hour. By 11:30 p.m., another pair of F-94 Starfires had arrived to Washington to try to intercept the UFOs. One pilot, John McHugo, argued that he saw no evidence of UFOs despite what his radar said, while the other pilot, Lieutenant William Patterson, reported seeing four lights on what he believed was a craft, which he gave chase to, yet after hitting his maximum speed at low altitude, Patterson was said to have given up as he had no chance to overtake the UFOs. After midnight, the Project Blue Book Pentagon liaison, Major Dewey Fournette, arrived alongside the Navy's highest-ranking radar specialist, Lieutenant John Holcomb. All in this viewing room, the highest-ranking specialists in the world agreed that what they were witnessing were solid metallic objects traveling at speeds unheard of for aircraft on Earth. Several civilian aircraft also reported seeing the UFOs, and many on the ground had also witnessed the event throughout Washington, D.C. In UFO sightings, the craft would vanish when they were approached by fighter jets, and they would only be visible until roughly moments before sunrise. And just as soon as these craft were witnessed, they were gone, with the next major report of UFOs after these in Washington, D.C., occurring in West Palm Beach, Florida, in August of 1952. Following the 1952 Washington, D.C. UFO sightings, Air Force Major General John Sanford, the USAF Director of Intelligence, and Major General Roger Ramey, the Director of Operations, held a massively reported on meeting at the Pentagon, claiming that while many of the UFO sightings, including those in D.C., are credible, none of them posed an immediate threat to the United States. When asked if the Army had sworn reports of UFO encounters from their pilots, Sanford replied, hundreds. However, just as soon as the government in Washington seemed to confirm the existence of UFOs, the entirety of the UFO craze was seemingly torn apart when an innocuous crew who was flying during the UFO sightings on July 26th claimed that they also witnessed the lights on their radar, and they claimed they found the source of the lights being the elaborately lavish steamboat of the Wilson lines, which was claimed to have powerful lights which somehow appeared on radars throughout Washington, D.C. We're also told, in the years since, it's reported that, quote, radar technology of 1952 was simply inaccurate, end quote. And many historians, including Harvard's Philip Klass, claim that UFO sightings are entirely the cause of human error, which is remarkable since we're told the smartest men in the field of radar and UFOs, or unidentified aircraft, were present to witness this event, and yet their opinion that UFOs existed was almost entirely discredited by the 1960s, when the UFO craze began to die out. However, the evidence of UFOs in Washington, D.C. is immense, and I'm sure if we had a chance to talk to someone like Valiant Thor, we could find out the truth. But I digress. I hope those theories were highly satisfying for you. Honestly, I did not expect to find so much information on just a few subjects or theories regarding Washington, D.C., but I really enjoyed making and sharing this video with you. If you like this more podcast-like discussion that I did today, let me know by hitting the thumbs up button. I thank you all so much for being here and helping my little channel to reach 133,000 subscribers. I'll leave a little photograph here. If you want to support my channel, you can go to the link in this photo. The Tin Foil Hat podcast with Sam Tripoli has also reached out to me, and I definitely want to give them a shout out for noticing my work. The community that we make is always growing, and we're all formulating our own opinions and finding out our own truth as we dissect this history. My trip to Washington, D.C. was one of the best, most awe-inspiring journeys I've taken in many years, and none of it would have been possible without you. I can't wait to hear your theories, your thoughts, and your opinions in the comment section, and I will talk to you all very soon on the next video.